The quiet Nigerian village of Akure was a picture of serenity. Nestled between lush palm trees and gently sloping hills, it was a place where time seemed to slow, and the hum of everyday life felt comforting. In the Ajamosu family's modest home, this tranquility was mirrored. The small but well-kept bungalow, adorned with flowering hibiscus bushes, stood as a testament to hard work and pride. Inside, the house was dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through the windows. Femi Ajamosu, the family's patriarch, was a man of stature and respect. As the treasurer of the local cooperative, he was trusted, admired, and often regarded as the moral compass of the village. His wife Adebisi was the backbone of their family, a tireless homemaker with a reputation for her warm smile and steady presence. Their 16-year-old daughter Dara was the apple of her father's eye and the envy of her peers, known for her intelligence and infectious laugh. That night, however, the facade of perfection began to crumble. The household was steeped in silence, save for the occasional chirp of crickets and the soft rustling of palm fronds outside. Adebisi lay in bed beside her husband, her breathing steady but shallow from the day's exertion. In the adjoining room, Dara lay curled up beneath a worn floral quilt, her favorite book still open on the bedside table. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. But peace was an illusion. In the dead of night, the floorboards creaked faintly, a sound so subtle that it might have been dismissed as the house settling. Yet it wasn't. The deliberate, hesitant footsteps echoed softly, growing louder as they approached Dara's room. Half asleep, Dara stirred. The shadows from the hallway stretched into her room, and her drowsy eyes caught movement. Groggy and disoriented, she squinted at the figure standing in the doorway. For a brief moment she thought it was her mother. The figure was tall, blocking the faint moonlight from the hallway. But as the person stepped closer, her sleep-addled mind sharpened with a jolt of clarity and fear. "Papa," she whispered, her voice trembling with confusion. "What are you doing here?" Femi stepped into the room, his bare feet soundless on the tiled floor. He was still wearing the loose traditional buba he had worn to bed, but his face was different, stripped of the fatherly warmth she had always associated with him. His expression was unsettling, a mixture of nervousness and something else Dara couldn't quite place but instinctively knew was wrong. "Shua, my darling," Femi said softly, his voice unusually gentle. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay. Papa's here." The touch was unfamiliar. It lingered a moment too long. Dara's heart began to race as an unexplainable dread washed over her, paralyzing her body. Her instincts screamed at her to move, to push him away, to shout, but she couldn't. Her voice was trapped in her throat. Femi sat on the edge of her bed, the mattress dipping under his weight. The room felt suffocatingly small. "You looked troubled earlier," he said, his tone too intimate, too soothing. "I just want to make sure you're all right." The words were innocuous, but the intent behind them felt anything but. Her chest tightened as panic bloomed within her. "Papa, I'm fine," Dara stammered, her voice barely audible. "Please, you should go back to bed." Before Femi could respond, a sharp voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Femi, what are you doing in there?" Adebisi called from the hallway. Her voice was laced with urgency, her tone sharper than Dara had ever heard it. Femi flinched, clearing his throat awkwardly. He stood up abruptly, his hand falling away from Dara's shoulder. "I thought I heard her crying," he said, his voice smooth and steady, as if he had rehearsed the excuse 1,000 times. He moved toward the door with calculated haste, brushing past his wife without meeting her eyes. Adebisi's gaze followed him as he retreated into their bedroom. She stood frozen for a moment, her expression unreadable, before turning to look at her daughter. Dara's face was pale, her wide eyes glistening with unshed tears. Adebisi's lips parted as if to speak, but the words died in her throat. She hesitated, lingering in the doorway, then turned and walked away. Dara sat upright in her bed, trembling. The room, once her safe haven, now felt alien and oppressive. Her mind raced as she tried to process what had just happened. The man who had always protected her, who had taught her to read under the mango tree, who had promised her the world, he had become a stranger in an instant. That night a line had been crossed. Though no words were spoken, the weight of what had transpired hung heavily in the air. The foundation of the Ajamosu family, seemingly unshakable, had begun to crack. Neither Dara nor Adebisi could ignore it for much longer. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the windows of the Ajamosu household, casting a deceptive warmth over the family's breakfast table. Femi, with his ever-confident demeanor, was back to being the charming patriarch. He hummed a church hymn under his breath, poured tea for Adebisi, and teased Dara about her messy braids. The air of normalcy was suffocating. Dara sat stiffly at the table, her movements mechanical as she toyed with her food. Adebisi couldn't ignore the tension radiating from her daughter. She noticed how Dara flinched slightly when Femi reached out to pat her head. Something was wrong. A mother's intuition whispered it, but Femi's easy charm made her question her own suspicions. "Eat, Dara," Femi said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You'll need your strength for school." Dara forced a nod, her gaze fixed on her plate. Adebisi's heart clenched. She glanced at her husband, searching his face for answers, but his expression was unreadable. Later that day, as Femi left for the cooperative's office and Dara headed to school, Adebisi began her usual chores. Cleaning the house had always been her way of maintaining control, a small act of order in an otherwise unpredictable world. But as she dusted the furniture in their shared bedroom, her hands froze mid-swipe. Tucked beneath Femi's pillow was an envelope. It was partially hidden, as if deliberately placed out of sight but not entirely out of reach. Adebisi hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She told herself it was probably nothing, a receipt or a business document. But curiosity gnawed at her, spurred by the growing unease that had lingered since the previous night. She pulled out the envelope, her hands trembling slightly. It was addressed to Tundalabi, a name she had never heard before. Femi had never mentioned anyone by that name. Adebisi frowned, turning the envelope over in her hands. Should she open it? The idea felt invasive, but an unsettling instinct pushed her forward. Her fingers tore open the envelope carefully, and she pulled out the folded paper inside. The letter was brief, written in Femi's precise, almost clinical handwriting. But the words made her stomach twist. "Tun. The arrangement remains as we discussed. Blessing must stay quiet. Ensure she has what she needs but no more than necessary. This cannot come back to me. Femi." Adebisi's breath hitched as the letter slipped from her fingers and floated to the floor. She stared at the words, their meaning sinking into her like a blade. Blessing? Who was she? What arrangement? And why the insistence on keeping her quiet? Her mind raced, replaying moments from the past weeks. Femi's late nights, his odd behavior, and the way Dara had looked at him with something other than admiration. A sinking realization began to take hold. This wasn't just about money or business. There was something darker at play. Adebisi picked up the letter, folding it back into the envelope with shaking hands. She couldn't ignore this. Whatever secrets Femi was hiding, they were not only threatening their marriage, but also their family's very foundation. When Femi returned home that evening, he found Adebisi waiting for him in the living room. The usual warmth in her eyes had been replaced by a cold resolve. Dara was in her room, the door shut tightly, and the house was unusually quiet. "Femi," Adebisi began, her voice steady but low. She held up the envelope. "Who is Tundalabi? And who is Blessing?" Femi froze, his briefcase dangling midair before he set it down slowly. His face darkened, but only for a fleeting moment before his lips curved into a dismissive smile. "What are you doing going through my things, Adebisi?" he asked, his tone calm but sharp. "That's not the answer to my question," Adebisi replied, standing her ground. "What is this arrangement? Why are you so desperate to keep this woman quiet?" Femi took a step forward and snatched the envelope from her hands. "This is business," he said curtly, stuffing the letter into his pocket. "You wouldn't understand. Business." Adebisi's voice rose, her frustration boiling over. "Since when does business involve silencing women? Don't treat me like a fool, Femi." Femi's jaw tightened. "Stay out of this, Adebisi," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous tone. "You have no idea what you're meddling with. And whose fault is that?" Adebisi shot back. "You've been keeping secrets for years, haven't you? How many more lies are you hiding?" Femi didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving Adebisi standing alone in the dimly lit room. The slam of the bedroom door echoed through the house, a chilling punctuation to their confrontation. Adebisi sat down, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She replayed the events of the past day, the letter, Dara's unease, and Femi's reaction. None of it added up to anything good. She pressed her palms to her temples, trying to make sense of it all. Who was blessing? Was this connected to Femi's behavior with Dara? And what was the price of staying silent? The questions gnawed at her, but one thing was clear. The man she had built her life with, the man she had trusted implicitly, was a stranger. And now it was up to her to uncover the truth, no matter how much it hurt. A week passed, and the atmosphere in the Ajamosu household grew heavier with each passing day. Adebisi noticed how Dara avoided her father, retreating to her room or finding excuses to leave the house whenever Femi was around. The once lively girl who filled the home with her infectious laughter now moved like a shadow, her shoulders hunched as though carrying an unbearable burden. Adebisi's concern deepened. She tried to draw Dara out, asking her questions about school or her friends, but Dara's responses were clipped, her eyes darting away as though she was afraid to meet her mother's gaze. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky and bathed the house in an orange glow, Adebisi found Dara sitting beneath the mango tree in their yard, clutching a worn notebook. Her daughter's face was pale, her eyes distant as she stared at the blank page before her. "Dara," Adebisi called softly, approaching her with care. She sat beside her daughter, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavily between them. "My child, what's troubling you? You've been so quiet lately." Dara hesitated, her fingers gripping the notebook tightly. "It's nothing, Mama," she mumbled, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Adebisi reached out, placing a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Dara, I know something is wrong. You can tell me anything. I'll always believe you." Those words broke the dam. Dara's chest heaved as tears spilled down her cheeks. She dropped the notebook, burying her face in her hands. Adebisi felt her heart shatter as she watched her daughter unravel before her. "Mama, I can't keep it inside anymore," Dara whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm so scared." Adebisi's arms encircled her daughter, holding her tightly. "Scared of what, my love? What's happened?" she asked, her own voice breaking. Dara pulled back slightly, her face streaked with tears. Her hands trembled as she tried to speak, the words catching in her throat. "That night when Papa came into my room," she began, her voice barely audible. He touched my shoulder and he sat on my bed. He said things, Mama. Things that didn't feel right. I didn't know what to do. I froze." Adebisi's entire body went cold, her grip on Dara tightening as the words sank in. "My God," she whispered, her own tears pooling in her eyes. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Dara shook her head, fresh tears streaming down her face. "I was scared, Mama. I thought you wouldn't believe me. Papa is so respected. He's the treasurer of the community. Who would believe me over him?" Adebisi's heart shattered into pieces. The weight of her daughter's fear, combined with her own guilt, felt like a crushing blow. She had seen glimpses of Femi's darkness over the years, his temper, his secrets, but she had convinced herself that questioning him would disrupt the delicate balance of their family. Now, faced with the raw pain in Dara's voice, she realized the true cost of her silence. "Dara, listen to me," Adebisi said firmly, cupping her daughter's tear-streaked face. "This is not your fault. Do you hear me? Not one bit. You are my daughter, and I will protect you with everything I have. I should have seen the signs. I should have done something sooner. But I see now, and I promise you this ends today." Dara's sobs quieted as she looked into her mother's eyes, seeing the fierce determination that had replaced her usual softness. For the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. Her mother believed her. She wasn't alone anymore. Adebisi spent the rest of the evening sitting with Dara under the mango tree, listening as her daughter recounted the details of that horrifying night. It was the hardest thing she had ever had to hear, but she knew she needed to absorb every word, to understand the depths of the trauma her daughter had endured. As night fell and the stars appeared in the sky, Adebisi held Dara close, whispering promises of protection and justice. She didn't know what her next steps would be, but one thing was clear. She could no longer turn a blind eye. The man she had once trusted with her life had betrayed their family in the worst way, and she would do everything in her power to ensure he would never hurt Dara, or anyone else, again. The resolve in her heart burned brightly, cutting through the despair. This was just the beginning of the battle, but Adebisi was ready. For Dara, for herself, and for the family Femi had betrayed, she would fight. That night, as the house settled into silence, Adebisi sat upright in bed, her eyes fixed on Femi. He lay on his side, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of sleep. In the dim glow of the moonlight, his face looked almost innocent, peaceful and unburdened. Yet, to Adebisi it was the face of a stranger. For years she had thought she knew him, the man she married, the father of her children, the respected treasurer of their community. But now that image was shattered, replaced by a darkness she could no longer ignore. Her mind raced with questions. How long had Femi been hiding this side of himself? How many moments of silence and obedience had allowed him to grow comfortable in his deceit? She thought of Dara's tears, her trembling voice as she recounted what had happened. Adebisi felt a pang of guilt. She had failed to protect her child, and now the weight of that failure crushed her chest like a stone. As the hours dragged on, Adebisi remained awake, staring at the man she had vowed to honor and love. Her stomach churned as she realized that every kind word, every loving gesture he had offered, was now tainted. By morning, she knew she couldn't keep living in silence. She needed guidance, but from whom? Who could she trust with such a horrifying truth? The next morning, Adebisi left the house early, her mind set on visiting Pastor Alyamide, the head of their church and a longtime family friend. He was known for his wisdom and had counseled many families through their darkest times. Surely, if anyone could help her navigate this nightmare, it would be him. The walk to the church felt longer than usual. The familiar sights of the village, the children playing by the roadside, the women carrying baskets of produce, the vendors shouting prices at the market, seemed distant, almost unreal. Adebisi's feet felt heavy with dread as she climbed the steps to the small chapel, her heart pounding with every step. Inside, the air was cool and still. Pastor Alyamide was sitting at his desk, reading from a worn Bible. He looked up when Adebisi entered, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Ah, Sister Adebisi," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "What brings you here so early?" Adebisi hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. How could she even begin to explain what was happening in her home? She took a deep breath and forced the words out. "Pastor, I need your guidance. Something has happened. Something terrible." The smile faded from Pastor Alyamide's face as he leaned forward, listening intently. Adebisi recounted everything, Dara's confession, her own guilt, and the man Femi had revealed himself to be. Tears streamed down her face as she spoke, her voice trembling with the weight of her fears. When she finished, the pastor leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. For a moment the room was silent, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves outside the window. "Sister Adebisi," he said finally, his voice calm but firm, "these are delicate matters. You must tread carefully." Adebisi frowned, confused by his tone. "Delicate matters? Pastor, my daughter is suffering. She's been hurt by her own father. I can't stay silent." The pastor sighed, his gaze heavy. "I understand your pain, but you must think of the consequences. If this becomes public knowledge, it will ruin your family's reputation. Femi's position in the community will be destroyed. Is that what you want?" Adebisi stared at him, disbelief washing over her. "Reputation," she repeated, her voice rising. "What about Dara? What about her pain? Should I sacrifice my child's well-being to protect my husband's name?" Pastor Alyamide shook his head, his tone placating. "Sister Adebisi, I am not saying you should ignore what has happened, but family matters should stay within the family. Handle this privately, for the sake of your home." Adebisi's chest tightened, anger bubbling beneath her grief. "And what about justice, Pastor? What about protecting my daughter?" The pastor's expression grew stern. "Justice is the Lord's work, not ours. Your duty is to preserve your family. Pray for Femi and pray for your daughter. God will guide you." Adebisi left the church feeling more broken than when she arrived. The man she had turned to for guidance, the man she had trusted to be a moral compass, had offered her nothing but empty platitudes. His words echoed in her mind. Family matters should stay within the family. She walked through the village in a daze, her steps aimless. The vibrant chatter of the market seemed to mock her, a cruel reminder of how oblivious everyone else was to her pain. She passed neighbors who smiled and greeted her warmly, unaware of the storm raging inside her. By the time she returned home, Adebizi's heart was heavy with a bitter truth. No one would help her. Not the pastor, not the community, not the church she had devoted her life to. She was alone in this fight. That night, as she lay in bed beside Femi, she stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. The man sleeping next to her, the man who had once been her partner, her protector, was now her enemy. And if no one else would stand up for Dara, Adebizi knew she would have to find the strength to do it herself. Her resolve hardened. She didn't know how, but she would fight. For Dara, for herself, and for the truth. Even if it meant standing alone against the world. The weeks that followed Dara's confession felt like a waking nightmare for Adebizi. Every moment in the Ajamosu household was thick with tension. The kind of suffocating quiet that could crack under the weight of a single misplaced word. Femi carried on as if nothing had changed, his jovial facade intact whenever he greeted neighbors or attended community gatherings. But inside the walls of their home, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Adebizi found herself on edge at all times. Every step Femi took, every word he said, every glance he cast toward Dara sent a wave of unease through her. She slept with one eye open, her heart pounding every time she heard the creak of a floorboard in the night. Dara, once the light of their home, had retreated into a shell, barely speaking and flinching at the sound of her father's voice. Even young Bayo, too young to understand the gravity of what was happening, sensed the change in the air and clung to Adebizi like a lifeline. One afternoon, while tidying Femi's study, Adebizi's gaze fell on a pile of papers haphazardly tucked beneath a stack of books. Her instincts, sharpened by weeks of suspicion, urged her to investigate. As she sifted through the pile, her hands froze when she came across a stack of receipts for money transfers. Each one bore the name Blessing Adeola and a note scribbled in Femi's handwriting. For the child. Adebizi's breath caught in her throat. The child? The words burned in her mind as a chilling thought took hold. Was Femi supporting another family? Was there a child out there? A child he had kept hidden from her? She clutched the receipts, her hands trembling. The realization sent a cold shiver down her spine. If these receipts were what they appeared to be, Femi's betrayal went far beyond what she had imagined. He wasn't just a man who had violated their daughter's trust. He was a man with secrets that could unravel the very fabric of their lives. That evening, as the children sat silently in the living room, Adebizi cornered Femi in the kitchen. Her voice was low but firm as she held up the receipts. What is this, Femi? Who is Blessing Adeola? And what child are you sending money to? Femi's face darkened, and for a moment, Adebizi thought she saw a flicker of panic in his eyes. But it was quickly replaced by his usual defiance. You've been snooping around my things? He barked, snatching the receipts from her hand. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't you dare turn this on me. Adebizi shot back, her voice rising with anger. You've been lying to me, to this family for years. What are you hiding, Femi? What have you done? Femi's rage exploded. You have no idea the pressure I'm under. Do you think it's easy running this household, keeping everyone fed and clothed? Sometimes a man has to make sacrifices. His voice echoed through the house, and Adebizi realized with horror that his outburst wasn't a denial. It was an admission. What sacrifices, Femi? Adebizi pressed, her voice shaking. What have you done to us? To Dara? To this family? But Femi had no answers, only more anger. He stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind him, leaving Adebizi standing there with her heart pounding in her chest. That night, as Adebizi lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she replayed the confrontation in her mind. Femi's explosive reaction, his refusal to answer her questions, the guilt she had seen flash across his face. It all pointed to one undeniable truth. There were more skeletons in his closet than she could count. She thought about the name Blessing Adeola and the words, for the child. Who was this woman? Where was she? And what connection did she have to Femi? The questions swirled in Adebizi's mind, each one more damning than the last. The next morning, the tension in the house was palpable. Femi barely spoke during breakfast, his usual charismatic demeanor replaced by a sullen silence. Dara sat with her head down, picking at her food, while Bayo chattered innocently, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. Adebisi decided she couldn't keep this burden to herself any longer. She needed answers, and if Femi wouldn't give them to her, she would find them herself. As soon as he left for work, she began asking discreet questions around the village. She visited the bank where Femi often conducted business, hoping to gather more information about the mysterious transactions. What she discovered only deepened the mystery. One of the tellers, a young woman named Funk, hesitated before answering Adebisi's questions. "Madam, I'm not supposed to say anything, but I've seen him sending money to that name Blessing Adeola for years now. It's always in cash, and he's always very secretive about it." Adebisi's stomach churned. Years? How long had Femi been leading this double life? And why had she been so blind to it? As Adebisi pieced together the fragments of Femi's lies, she realized that the man she had spent her life with was a stranger. His actions had cast a long shadow over their family, and the secrets he had worked so hard to bury were beginning to surface. Dara's silence, Bayo's innocence, and the weight of her own guilt drove Adebisi to a breaking point. She couldn't protect her children from the truth any longer. The darkness that Femi had brought into their home was spreading, and if she didn't act soon, it would consume them all. The Ajamosu family's foundation was crumbling, and Adebisi knew that the time for silence was over. Whatever Femi was hiding, whoever Blessing Adeola was, Adebisi was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost.